Thank you all for being here. It's maybe a bit irritating to have a philosopher speak on the second day that is dedicated to practice. And my talk will indeed be theoretical, but it has eminently practical implications. I'll start from a slightly different perspective than what we've heard in the past, although the topic was already there. Democracy is under threat, and there are many reasons for why this is an issue. And the political science literature distinguishes roughly two kinds of explanations. One is a kind of cultural explanation. Very roughly, there's a cultural backlash against modernity, resentment against minorities is building up, some people are maybe just racist by nature, whatever. And so we need to try to improve the democratic culture of our countries. That's certainly not wrong, but there's also another explanation, which is about the economy. And given that I'm standing here at a Common Good Economy conference, you'll not be surprised that I'll focus on this one. And this explanation emphasizes very much that the changes in the economic systems of the last decades have increased inequality and insecurity. There has been a loss of good jobs in many Western democracies in the sense that stable, long-term employment has become really a minority issue. And there's a lot of competitiveness in the economic system and a big question about the kind of social cohesion that democracy needs, but that this current economic system seems to undermine. Now, these two explanations need not be either or. I think they can mutually reinforce each other. But the problem with the cultural one is that it's pretty difficult to directly work on it. Yes, you can try to educate people. Yes, you can try to have dialogue sessions to improve civic engagement and so on. But I think ultimately, what's at least as important is to think about, okay, what kind of economic system is actually not only compatible with democracy, the current one I would say isn't, but actually reinforces a flourishing democratic life in society. And that's what I want to talk about in the next couple of minutes. Here's the preview. I'll first speak a bit in general on democracy as a principle for the economy. Then I'll go in more detail on some of the functional reasons for why a common good economy, and by the way, here you could also say a well-being economy, a donut economy, an alternative economy that's meant to serve people better, let me put it in that way, why such an economy needs democracy, and then I'll conclude with some more concrete ideas about what it could mean to democratize the economy. Now, let me start with a very rough picture. Who has already come across this historical picture on the left for you? Anyone's? Yeah, what is it? Can't hear you very well. So someone knows the name, what's it called? Divine. It's divine, if that was what I heard. Oh no, it's not Leviathan. No, that looks a bit similar, and political philosophers like to show that, but it's not, no. It's a different one. It's called the Great Chain of Being. And it's a vision of the cosmos, and this particular presentation is from the 16th century, but it was very widespread in medieval and early modern Europe in general. At the top, it's not the Leviathan, it's God, but in a sort of similar function. And then you have the different ontological layers, as it were, of the whole world. So you have angels, humans, animals, birds, trees, and underneath you have hell and the devils and so on. And it's clear that all of society stands in these hierarchical relations. It's always from top to bottom. And of course, it's religiously undergirded. And it's a picture in which every person in society needs to know their place, and they would always know who's above them and who's below them. Main stand on top of women in this hierarchy. Native people stand above foreigners. Settled people stand above traveling people. So all the forms of racism and exclusion that we see today, in a way, have historical roots in these kinds of hierarchies that were deeply ingrained in the cultural memory of Europe. And then, what happened over the course of centuries was the democratization of the political realm. Imperfect as it may be, and certainly is, but for the political realm, we've come to believe in a principle where everyone's equal and where we elect our representatives, but votes are equal. So that's this circle on top. The economy, in contrast, has basically retained this hierarchical picture. And the idea is that politics needs to stand on top of the economy and impose its more or less democratic principles on the economic system. But the logic of the economy is still that of hierarchies. If you look at the matrices of lots of organizations, you'll see something like the great chain of being. I mean, it's not God, it's the CEO or whatever, but the structure is the same. And all talk about matrix organizations or what have you, very often it's still this idea of hierarchy. And in that sense, it's also quite misleading to say that we live in market economies. That's partly true, but we also live in economies where work is organized very much in hierarchical structures. And the assumption is, within organizations, it must be hierarchical, and economists have provided lots of reasons for why it cannot be different. Now, I've put a question mark on this arrow between the political and the economic realm. Because this idea that we don't need a democratic economy because democratic politics imposes its rules on the economy, that has become quite questionable in recent years. Maybe it was true to some extent in the post-World War II years, when you had far fewer international capital flows and national politics was still much stronger compared to the economic actors. Also because there was always the threat on the horizon that, okay, there's also this other system out there called planned economies. And if you don't rein in the market economy in the right way, people might rebel and you might also get a planned economy. And that was, of course, the big fear. And so the power relation between economic and political actors was really different. Whereas today, it's pretty questionable whether we can still speak of a primacy of politics. That's how the social democratic tradition has called this principle. The primacy of politics means politics sets the rules and economic agents have to follow. If you tax them, they have to pay those taxes. If you ban certain materials, as we heard this morning, they have to follow through, and they cannot lobby against it. They cannot just do it in other countries. They just have to obey. And if you look at the reality out there, that's not what we see. Tax evasion is huge. Lobbying by transnational corporations is very powerful. The EU still has some chances because as a group of countries, it's such a large market that no company wants to lose that market. But in the US, the other big Western democratic system, there was one very influential Supreme Court judgment, Citizen United. Does that ring a bell? Well, it was a judgment that basically put an end to all limits of political donations. So there was no limitation anymore on money having an influence in politics. And that is seen by many political scientists as really the death knell of democracy, because if all campaign financing is done by private companies, and if there's no upper limit, and by the way, that's justified as freedom of speech, that's a very specific, very funny from a European perspective way in which Americans think of money and politics. It's free speech, so it cannot be banned, okay? But that means that there's no limit to lobbying by those with money, and the rest of society just, has to see what they can do. Now, that's the state of affairs we are in, and I think that needs to change, because otherwise what's happening is that we get a reversed arrow, and all the hierarchies, and all the exclusions, and all the forms of discrimination that are part of the hierarchies that we had historically will also return in the political realm. So, what should we do? So sorry, I had this here on the next slide, actually. In the Cold War period, there was this idea of a division of labor. Politics embeds the shared democratic values, and the economy is all about individual values and oriented towards efficiency and growth. In this room, I don't need to go into details here. But even if you just look at this in the abstract, efficiency and growth are normatively underdetermined because, well, growth is a problematic ideal, as we've heard many times here, given environmental concerns. I would also say moral concerns, in the sense that economic growth might actually lead us away from the things that matter most in life, which are not material goods. And efficiency is not a first-order value. Efficiency is a second-order value. Once you've determined the values that you want to pursue, you can say, okay, we want to pursue those without waste. Fine. But to make efficiency the overarching value of the economic system is a kind of category mistake. And you always need to ask, well, efficiency for whom? And who can use claims about efficiency as an ideological smokescreen? So that's not a sufficient answer to what the economy should look like. Now, we've heard already about Aristotle and Mill and other philosophers. I've brought you one who's pretty unknown, but I sort of rediscovered his writings, and I think they are really interesting. Anyone knows this person? No. Not quite, a bit older. H.A. Tawney. There was a British moral socialist, as the school was called, from the first half of the 20th century. He's written a book called The Acquisitive Society, which is about 100 years old, but it reads as if it was written for today, apart from a few things on gender and family, but okay. In terms of the analysis of the economy, he's really point on. What he argues is that the economy needs a reorientation from growth to what he calls functions. So for him, the opposite of the acquisitive society is the functional society, where the economy serves societal functions. And if you take this as a starting point, then the question is always, how can we orient economic institutions towards these functions? And we can call this the common good. We can also use other terms. As we saw yesterday evening, there's actually a lot of convergence between these different principles. But in any case, we have the planetary boundaries as constraint, and we need a system that's sustainable. So within these boundaries, we need to determine what functions we actually want. And the interesting thing is that Tawney then says very clearly, the mistake of the acquisitive society is that it puts property rights first, and it then sort of leads to only contingent relations between property rights and functions. What we need to do is put functions first and then design property rights such that the functions get fulfilled, but not just contingently, but systematically. So, very interesting ideas, I think. Now, much as I liked Tawney when I discovered him, I think he's also a bit weak when it comes to how we determine these functions. And here, democracy comes in. I think the kind of economy that is an alternative to the acquisitive society or neoliberalism or whatever you call it needs democracy. And it needs it not just in the sense of, oh, democracy sets the framework, but it needs it from the get-go and inside all of its institutions. And I'll first say why I think that's the case, and then I'll say what form this can take. So I have 2.5 reasons for that. The reason number one is political reason. And that can be divided into a couple of subpoints. If if we want a new economic system, there needs to be legitimacy for it. And we saw some numbers during these days already that the current system is actually losing legitimacy, and at a very high speed. But a new system will also need to create new legitimacy. And that's also true at the local level, but also at the national and the international level. Some people these days say we need a kind of war economy. We need an economy where some kind of leadership imposes certain constraints or goals on us, and the rest of society simply has to go along, because the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and the other ecological crises are so urgent that we cannot wait. Sometimes on my bad days, I think they are right. On the good days, I think, no, that's not the way to go. We still want to save our democracies, and we need people to come along and to accept this new system, and that means they also need to have a voice in shaping it. So legitimacy is crucial. It's also pretty practical. If you have local projects like for the energy transition, there can be lots of ways of resisting and blockading, delaying, and so on, if you don't create legitimacy. The second reason in this political dimension has to do with accountability and counterpower. You often get nice declarations by corporations about how they will do better. There was this business roundtable thing on purpose, but there is no accountability. And there are also lots of initiatives that up to this day only rely on voluntary actions by companies, which is nice, and maybe it's a first step to show what's possible. But the system towards which we should move should not be one where it depends on the goodwill of company owners that they are doing the things that are the right thing to do. Instead, you need counterpower, you need people, and not just anyone in the public, but people who really know about a company, who can really say, hey, you're not following your own principles. Typically, the own employees are in the best position to do this. And a third dimension of the political reason is the fair distribution of benefits and burdens. And for that, you need, again, democratic procedures. That's sometimes discussed, or I would rather say part of that gets discussed in the just transition discourse, which is very much about how the transition towards a more ecologically sustainable system needs to be socially just in the sense of preserving jobs. And that's why the role of union is important, and why you need to give people opportunities to get retrained and so on. It's still very much focused on an old model of work and a traditional notion of a job, but at least there's a recognition that you cannot just have ecological sustainability without social sustainability. And ultimately, again, this is a matter where people need to have voice, so we need democratic rules, procedures, participation. Now, the second reason, that gets a little bit technical. In philosophy, we say epistemic when we mean things that have to do with knowledge. Epistemology is the study of what human beings can know. And in recent years, there has been quite a discussion about the epistemic advantages or disadvantages of democracy. Some people have argued democracy is really bad in dealing with knowledge, and others have defended democracy, saying, no, it's actually the best way to activate the knowledge of all citizens in order to have good governance, a good process of policy making. That, again, has to do with legitimacy, as I just mentioned it, because there's also the concept of output legitimacy that concerns the quality of policies. And you need to have good knowledge mechanisms to achieve good policy outcomes. So one thing that was already discussed here a bit is, well, who actually defines the functioning of the economy? And one concrete form that this takes is, who defines the indicators that could replace GDP? I would say, and Christian also mentioned this is a democratic task. This should not be done in a top-down technocratic way, but really in a democratic way. And why is that important? Here's a bit of Aristotle. This phrase, the knowledge of the many, is from Aristotle. The advantage of broad democratic participation is that you get lots of different perspectives, lots of different forms of knowledge, lots of different skills that can be used together. Also, another epistemic issue is that while we have general ideas for what can be done for the energy transition, for more socially sustainable work and so on, they will have to be applied locally. And local can mean really regionally in a specific place. It can also mean in a specific company, in a specific organization. And no matter how good the recipe book, I strongly believe you always also need practical wisdom to implement these kinds of ideas in a specific place, in a specific organization, and so on. And to do that well, you need local knowledge. You need the understanding of the situation from people who've been there, who know the social relations, who know the traditions, the mores. And so to really implement solutions, you cannot just have one-size-fits-all recipes or general rule books. You really need to involve people on the ground. And lastly, another epistemic argument for democratic participation is that the transition towards a new economic system is a task that will require bringing together very different forms of knowledge. Practical, theoretical, from the natural sciences, from the social sciences. And I mean, I work at a university. All universities talk about inter- and transdisciplinary research. In practice, this is really difficult. Everyone has their own frameworks, their own background assumptions, their own jargon. And then trying to really see, okay, here's one study saying that. How can we integrate this with another study with a different methodology saying something else? Which studies do we even need? This is a huge and non-trivial task. And then when it comes to local applications, what can you learn from all of these studies? It becomes even more complicated. And the only way we have for bringing together these different forms of knowledge is actually what Jürgen Habermas and other philosophers have called deliberation. So discussion that is really open-minded, not marred by power structures or biases, but tries to be as open and as honest in its conversations as is humanly possible. Of course, because we're all humans, it's never perfect, but that's an ideal that we can at least strive towards. Now, you've probably already been thinking about all kinds of objections in your head, and my third consideration, I'm calling it consideration because it's not clearly a reason for or against, is, well, how can this actually work to democratize the economy? And what I suggest here is a toolbox approach, and here is why and what I mean by this. Now, one objection that one hears a lot when one talks about democratizing the economy, and by the way, not only from economists, but also from people in practice, organizational leaders, when one says democratization, they are afraid of at least two things, apart from losing their own power, but okay, that's psychologically understandable. But here are two serious things they are worried about. One is democracy slows things down and we don't get anything done. There's a book on social movements that has a nice title, Democracy is an Endless Meeting. And that's of course meant ironically. But, you know, if you have been in social movements, you probably recognize a little bit that yes, meetings can be endless and there can be challenges of how do you involve everyone, hear every voice, and yet get to decisions. And the second worry that you hear is democratization also creates too many veto points. So that's a concept from political science that gets used for political systems. And the question is, at what many points in the system can someone veto or delay something? And if you have too many veto points, then a system gets stuck, grinds to a halt, nothing happens. And arguably, our political democracies are not in the optimal shape with regard to that. There are many veto points, maybe too many. And this is also a real worry if you say we should democratize the economy, because, well, then it's not only about what happens in the capitals of the cities, but also what happens on the ground. And then people might even get worried, well, will the economy still function? Will it deliver goods and services that we need? I think the response to these two objections is that we need to find the right democratic tools for different occasions. And that's very much a kind of experimental approach. We know some things, but there's a lot more that we can learn. For example, I mentioned deliberation. Deliberation is, in a way, the endless meeting. I mean, Habermas makes absence of time constraints one of the criteria for deliberation. But sometimes you can also elect representatives. And then you have a smaller group, and those people might still need to deliberate, but it's more manageable, and you can come to decisions more quickly. Can also introduce new biases. If you look at today's political democracies, the parliaments are overwhelmingly, well, they are more male than female. They are also more formally educated than practically educated, and there are lots of other biases. That's the kind of stuff you often get in elections. We would probably also have to struggle with this in elections in economic institutions. One response that has come up in response to that problem is, let's not have elections which introduce all these biases. Let's use lotocracy. Lotocracy is the idea that you select representatives in a randomization strategy. So by lot is the literal meaning. In practice, it means you try to look at the population. You define certain parameters like demographic features, age, gender, regional distribution, background, and so on. And then you try to mimic the population as a whole in a representative assembly. And then that assembly can, again, deliberate, maybe write recommendations, or even make decisions. And in the economy, what's also particularly interesting is bottom-up, team-based approaches. In a way, you could say, in economic institutions, we have to work together all the time anyway, but then the question is it hierarchically structured or is it egalitarian? And interestingly, the research on these team-based approaches in companies was actually quite strong in the 70s and 80s, and there were quite a few success stories. But then what happened? The Japanese scare. All these Japanese companies are so much more efficient. And the general downturn of the economy and neoliberal ideas. And so this was sort of cut off, but it's picking up speed again to better understand what makes successful democratic teams possible. And another parameter with which you can design the right tools for the right occasion is that, of course, we have different federal levels. Certain things should be decided at a very low level with all the people who are directly involved. For others, it makes more sense to go to a higher level. I actually think that there's a big question at the moment about how to coordinate central and decentral approaches in the right way. So I'll put this out there as a question, because I don't have the answer. How do you, for what kind of policy areas do you need more centralized, more decentralized approaches? What are the criteria? How do you make the decisions? I think that's one of the really interesting coordination questions for a new economic system. Last but not least, I also want to emphasize that I don't think that democratic decision-making doesn't take any time and energy. It does. So the meeting may not be endless, but it will take some time. And even if you use all kinds of new technologies, online communication, online deliberation tools, there's really interesting stuff out there. It saves a bit of time, still takes time. So I think we can acknowledge this. But that time and energy is often an investment which then pays off later in the process because you save time and trouble in the implementation phase. Why? Everyone has, well, in an ideal process, be heard. People understand why the decisions are being taken, and you have created legitimacy, and people really understand the reasons for why certain decisions have been made. And that means that the implementation can then go more smoothly. Whereas if you have a very small group behind closed doors taking decisions and then presenting them to everyone else without explanation, just top down, then the problems often come later on in the implementation phase. And that's why, even though they may be time-consuming, democratic approaches often pay off later on in the process. So I think overall we don't have to worry about things getting too slow or having too many veto points. We need to be wise and we need to study and learn more what tools work for what occasions. Now, what does this mean in a bit more practice? The first principle for democratizing the economy is workplace democracy. And that is a keyword that has now received a lot of attention again in academic research, and there's also more and more public discourse about this. It's about the voice and the rights that workers have in their daily workplaces. Now, the sort of ideal model of workplace democracy is the worker cooperative. You can also think about other models. Some European countries have co-determination, which is not a perfectly democratic system, but it gives workers and their representatives more voice than if you have purely Anglo-Saxon companies. The funny thing is that according to textbook economic theory, Austria and Germany and probably also the Netherlands should actually be bankrupt, because they do give workers some voice in company decision making. And according to economic theory, on a global market, they would be outcompeted by purely shareholder-oriented companies. That's not the case, so the theory has its gaps, let's say. But of course, there are many questions about how far these forms of participation that we already have can go. And there is also a bit of a problem of many of these institutions not having aged ideally, to put it carefully, so in the sense that they don't have a lot of acceptance among younger people. They are seen as also being very bureaucratic and hierarchical. They function best insofar as they still function for sort of standard industrial jobs, but there are fewer and fewer of those. For the service sectors, for example, you have far less of that kind of co-determination and union representation and so on. So even though the European countries here have a heritage that they could actually be proud of and build on, there's also a lot of work to do. But what's really interesting is that in US-American progressive discourse, people are now looking at these models and proposing something like, oh, should we have a few worker representatives on company boards? Wouldn't that be a good idea? And in many European countries, we have something like this, but we don't really appreciate it or do something with it. So I think here a lot can be done. And there is some evidence that co-determined companies are also doing better on lots of other sustainability counts. Now, those are statistical analysis, so you can always, question how much does that say. But it seems a plausible hypothesis that employees are often the ones who would suffer from lots of forms of environmental degradation. They live in the environment of a company, they want to keep their jobs in the long run. So often they have a greater interest in a company also being environmentally sustainable than shareholders who are somewhere far away or where there's a pension fund in between and it's not clear what interest they would have. There is a discussion in that literature on the distinction between representative and participatory approaches. Representative means either electing or selecting representatives. Participatory is the bottom-up, everyday participation where people really get a voice. I think they are both needed, because if you only have the representative model, often these people run the risk of losing the connection to the participatory ones. And also, very practically speaking, you need the participatory models to grow the skills and to spot the talents that can then be the representative leaders for employee representation, also on company boards and so on. Second level, sectorial and regional approaches. I've put in a few things here, but I think I can be pretty brief because this is very much in line, although it's not exactly the same, but it overlaps with what Bas van Babel has talked about yesterday. He talked about the principle of association, of people coming together around a common good, a common goal, and organizing. And many sectorial and regional approaches are also like this. Sectorial bargaining means not every worker on their own needs to negotiate. It's the group, typically the union, that negotiates for the whole association. Regional networks are also extremely important. And what's also in practice a very important mechanism is sectorial or regional collaboration on shared standards. At the moment, there's a lot of sort of company politics going into standard setting, but from a profit-oriented logic. And we've heard lots of examples here at the conference about how regional collaboration can also facilitate the individual company or individual in doing what they want to do. And if they have a shared narrative and shared standards for what they do, this also facilitates the positioning of these projects in the broader landscape. And then finally, at the national level and the international level, what we need to re-establish, and I have no silver bullet for how to do this. I have a few ideas that we can talk about later. But we need to do whatever it takes to re-establish the primacy of politics. I think it's an illusion to think that bottom-up principles and approaches only without legislative initiatives will cut the ice when it comes to many environmental and social problems. We need legislation. It needs to be a political issue. And that means that we can ask all kinds of questions about lobbying power, transparency, which groups get hurt, which groups don't get hurt. And we need more international agreements, because otherwise companies play out countries against each other, as they so often have. So what we need to move towards is away from the great chain of being. And by the way, this is not anti-religious or anything. You can have lots of forms of religion where God is still in heaven, but human beings are all equal, and it's not some human beings having authority over others. Towards a system where both the economy and the political system are democratically organized and can, influence each other. Because then an economic democracy can also stabilize political democracy and help implement democratic principles in the institutions that really matter for people's lives every day. If you just go to elections every 4 years and then it's this big battle that feels more like a sports event, that doesn't help you learn democratic principles in practice. If you have to decide democratically together with your colleagues about certain policy issues in your company, you'll learn what it means to come to a compromise, to accept someone else's position, sometimes to also lose, sometimes to win in a vote, but to really accept the other as equal. And I think that's what we need if you want to stabilize the economy, make it sustainable, but also save democracy. Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Lisa, for this very interesting, inspiring lecture. And I find it just so beautiful to see that all of the presentations that we have had so far during this conference, they are so different yet so complementary. And this one adds to it as well. We have now time for questions, but I have one concern. And my concern is that there are way more questions than we have time to answer. And how do we make choices on who is going to be able to ask a question whilst we are all equal? So I would suggest to adopt the principle of lotocracy. And we just randomly give people the chance to ask a question.
I have a quick question. I'm going to be very fast. So I by no means I'm an expert, but I've thought a lot about how to democratize the economy. And I follow your line of argumentation, and I find it very inspirational and interesting. But there's one thing that I'm missing, and that is the role of the individual and the responsibility that the individual has on how to use that voice. So I would like to know what is your point of view there.
Yeah, thank you. That is actually a very interesting question, and I'm also, in a big organization that is a university where we're trying to, make some things a bit more democratic, and I often see a very fine balance between offering support structures for individuals for their voice to be protected, so for example, an ombudsperson, and encouraging people, empowering people to also speak for themselves. And I think there is a cultural element there, and of course, the more you have hierarchical relations without counterpower, the more difficult it becomes for people to speak up. It becomes understandable why they wouldn't dare to do this. And so there's a chicken and egg problem between structure and culture. And I think especially on this area, this issue of a democratic culture, there is also a lot of need for research and experimentation, because a lot of the research has really focused on the structures so far. In the Netherlands, there's now a lot of discourse on social safety, which in a way means that people feel safe to speak up and so on. But it's also, there's a risk of this being co-opted by organizations in a way that is just about avoiding liability. And so I think ultimately we also need to think about, okay, what does it mean for schools? How do people learn democratic habits already there? And how can we really empower people and without offering so many support structures that they then actually feel, in a way, disenabled, or that it becomes easier for them to go the indirect route rather than speaking up for themselves. So I think that's a societal learning process where we still need a lot of research, but we also need to experiment and to see, okay, what works? What are the recipes? We've done one study on corporations or other organizations that introduce deliberation internally. And one thing that's shown up in all the examples is it does take time. You cannot expect to switch a hierarchical organization to a democratic, egalitarian culture, empowering all individuals, giving them the right, but also the responsibility to take it up in just a couple of weeks. It's a learning process. And then you also get interesting questions about the degree to which people need to really open up, show their vulnerabilities. Are people able to apologize to one another? So I think that it's a very important area, and I don't have the answers yet, but I think we know where we need to look for further answers and what kind of studies we can do to further expand our learning on that.
Yeah, Remco.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I'm going to try to put this try to explain this in the most unphilosophical way as I can. So the thing which I'm interested in, so you're using this concept of deliberation by Habermas, but that requires to a certain extent an introduction in the political sphere, in the sense that people need to be introduced in, like Arendt says, tries to introduce people and educate them in what it means to be a democratic citizen, mean to be a person there. So what are the elements that you would introduce in order to safeguard such certainty that people are able to do that people are able democratic people?
That's a big question, and there's also the kind of chicken and egg question between behavior and structures that shown up a bit also in the previous question. One thing that I would want to say against Arendt, much as I like her, is that she makes this big distinction between the public realm where deliberation is possible and then labor and work, which follow other logics. I think work has the potential to have at least certain spaces that are public in her sense. If only the locker room where people have some time that they spend together. And how you can cultivate this sense of citizenship, of people really being able to talk to each other, that's indeed a key question, but I think we have certain parameters that we can know about. Here's one sort of obvious thing, but it's not obvious how to implement it in practice. The more work gets concentrated and the denser the work rhythm becomes, the less time people have for the famous water cooler conversations, the coffee kitchen, the conversations about something that's not directly work related, that are so important for cultivating that sense of equal conversations. And I think that was also one of the interesting experiences of the corona pandemic. Yes, we can work together online, but all these things are very hard to replicate. We can focus only on the functional stuff and not on these prototypes of conversations. And I think there are real questions there about how much we intensify the work rhythm. And there's now a lot of discussion about a 4-day work week, which in principle I think is very laudable. But I think there's a real question about, okay, how intensified is the work going to be in these 4 days? And what will that mean for the kind of culture that can develop between people at work? So I think time is a key issue. How much time do we have for encountering each other? And what does this mean for the kinds of conversations that are possible? As I already mentioned, formal hierarchies without counterpower are, of course, toxic for that kind of conversation. So that's another thing we do know about. What we also know is that lack of sensitivity to different cultural or also class backgrounds can also be a very toxic issue here. If you try to be respectful, but you have no idea where the other person is coming from, that can also then lead to situations that are not at all respectful towards the other person. So I think that we have bits and pieces out there, and we need to build the culture in each organization using these building blocks. And again, experiment, see what works. It will never be stable. We cannot say, okay, now we've reached it because it needs to be reproduced, the next generation needs to be introduced in it. But I think that's just a feature. That's not something we can do anything about. Culture needs to be maintained. And I think in lots of economic institutions, there are obvious places to start. And then we might get to the points where the questions you're raising become more relevant. But there are obvious hierarchical issues that we can deal with. There are obvious cultural diversity issues. And there are obvious time issues. So why don't we start at what we know about and then try to move forward as we go along?
Yes, thank you. My question is about the central theme of today, which is practice.
Yeah.
And in your presentation, you introduced the concept of functionality, which might become very practical, I think. And I was wondering how you wanted to make the connection between that practical approach and democracy. And I was expecting you to talk about holacracy, which is a kind of democracy with different roles in an ecosystem. I don't know if you are familiar with that concept, but if so, I'm curious about your ideas about the future promise or expectations on holacracy.
Yeah, thank you. I'm roughly familiar, and I think it's a very interesting practice for implementing participatory decision-making. I don't think it's the only one, and I think it also presupposes many of these cultural practices that we've just talked about in response to the other two questions. Some of the organizations we studied in this research I just mentioned were using it, but they were also all very much adapting it to their own needs. So what I said earlier about, okay, there's a rule book, but then you need to locally implement it, that's at least in this study what we also found for people or groups using holacracy as an approach. There is also another question that comes up from what you said about functions, practice, and democracy, which is who in the end decides about the functions of certain economic activities? Who decides what the end goal is? And I mean, of course, you can have fully holacratic organizations. But what we also found in this empirical work was that sometimes people try to use it within larger organizations in small units. And then the problem they run up against is that the goals and the constraints are still coming from the larger organization. And there you don't have democratic structures. And then, of course, it can only go so far. So ultimately, I think the functions also need to be democratically determined. But there are interesting questions there about who has the right to do this. So my students think that they should be the ones who determine that's what they call democratic, what they should learn. I see what they mean, but I also think, well, but you know, you don't even know what the choice is because you don't know beforehand what you might learn. So it needs to be a dialogue, and the same in hospitals between the patients and the doctors. So you have lots of questions about who it is, which groups should together determine the functions. But we are also so far away from whatever ideal answer to that question we could give in many practical contexts that there's a lot of room for improvement. And holacracy, I think, is one of the strategies that can then be used.
Yeah, I had basically a follow-up question to that.
Can you raise your hand because I don't see you?
Hi, sorry, in the front.
Oh, there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's sort of a follow-up question. I've recently read some papers on de-democratization in light of increasing inequalities or rising polarization as manifestations of democratic backsliding. But I kind of got the feeling that in these kind of papers, we often strive towards just gaining democracy back, but I'm always wondering what kind of democracy do we want? Do we want a democracy from the 1970s? Because in my opinion, that wasn't really as participatory because of a lot of men making the decisions in politics and other organizations and the exclusion of minorities. And like here, we kind of formed a consensus yesterday amongst some people that democracy is about participation. But I was wondering now, maybe you implicitly said it, but what is your definition of a democracy? And then in regards to that, do we first need a common vision of democracy, which is really hard to get, in order to actually re-democratize to a new democracy?
Small question you're asking, right? Okay, let me say two things. The first is, no, I don't want the 70s back, and I think you can take any of the kind of standard definitions of democracy, like rule by the people, for the people, through the people, or whatever. There are huge questions at the moment about, is it actually true that the people have the power? And often the answer is no, and one of the key reasons is because of how the economic system functions. And that on its own would be enough of a reason to say, well, we need to also democratize the economy. But then there's this other reason that I think for the long-term stability of democracy, we cannot just have a kind of outer shell of democratic institutions that is very far from the everyday life of people, and then have their lives organized by very different logics, like market competition, hierarchies, and so on. So we need to really embed democratic values in the principles, in the principles that govern these institutions. And I mean, a lot of this talk these days about rebuilding democracy is on polarization and how, especially in two-party systems, but also in many other countries, the ability of people to talk across partisan divides, the willingness, that all seems to go down very strictly. And there's a big debate about the role of social media for that, but it's still not so clear whether they are really the culprit. One interesting data point here is that the institutions where people are most likely to have meaningful cross-partisan conversations are actually workplaces, and in the US, where lots of these studies are about, school boards. Now, what do school boards and workplaces have in common? you need others there that you haven't chosen. Because in all self-chosen organizations, you tend to have these bubbles of like-minded people who reinforce their own opinion. And in the economy, you have a certain, almost coercive element in the sense that, okay, most people need to work. Maybe that should change. That's another debate. But at the moment, that's what we have. And even if you didn't have the coercive dimension, you'd still have a functional logic that's different from just you belong to that camp and I belong to the other camp. It's more about we together need to get certain things done in a very practical way. And that's why these contexts are, in my opinion, and as I said, there's empirical research that undergirds this, our best hope for also dealing with this huge issue of polarization, because people get to know each other not just as, oh, that's this right-wing person, but also, okay, they can be a good worker on this or that. And then maybe we can rebuild common ground also from the bottom up by not saying, okay, work follows a different logic and democracy needs to find its place somewhere else, and then no one has time for it, no wonder. So that's also why I think democratizing work and democratizing the economy is so important for the overall project. I could speak on forever, but I'll stop here.
Let's do one final question.
Yeah, I would like to ask you from a different perspective. So I don't work in a big company. I'm in this organizational stuff where we work together as individual workers. And we hear a lot about talk about participation economy, and so very often me or my colleagues are demanded for our opinion, and it costs a lot of time which is not paid for, and we all have to participate. Well, I can tell you there's only a limited amount of time you can ask from people out there to participate, because we actually need to work or do other stuff. So I'm not sure if democracy, in the sense that everybody has to participate in making decisions, is the solution all the time. You say there's different types of finding your decision making depending on the issue. And what we are actually now working on in my organization is a different way, which is we gather around an issue, which is for us a just and healthy food system. And we work very locally. And then we have a new way, we call it initiative and consultation. So we don't, because in some of our organizations we can talk forever if everybody needs to agree all the time. So we say, no, you can take an initiative when you're still within the realm of this common goal. You can take the initiative and you have the obligation for consultation. Yep. And then you only include the people that actually want to be consulted, and then you're obliged to listen. But then we give you the trust that you will make the decision for the ideas that you have. And then we have a whole different way. It's based on trust and solidarity and a joint goal. And we don't need all that democratic stuff that you
I would reframe your contribution here by saying that's a democratic tool. That's one way of democratic decision making. But you first need to agree together that this is how the group will work. And this, I've heard this also from other organizations, that you cannot have everyone participate all the time, totally. So for certain areas, people have the right to go, they need to consult, or there's sometimes certain budget limits up to that. We just trust each other and so on. I see this as part of the democratic toolbox. The question is, how far can you go with that? And at what point do you then have to reconvene the whole group and, have a meeting with everyone again to think about, okay, how does it work? So one thing that I haven't gone into, to not make it too theoretical, but it's actually also very practical. when you use these democratic tools, you also need a kind of meta discourse about, okay, do the tools actually work? Do we get good decisions, but do we also keep our democratic principles through them? And that's also what I would say about these consultancy methods. That can really be a way of joint decision making, but from time to time, you need the reflection with everyone, well, does it work? Because in informal structures, the cliche is that they are democratic because they're informal, but they can also lead to the power of cliques and informal power structures that can be very undemocratic, and that's what you wouldn't want. And so you then again need democratic forms where you reflect on, okay, what are we doing, and are we doing it in the way that corresponds to our values? And I'll stop here, but thanks for putting that democratic tool on the table. That's how I would phrase it.